Everyone, and welcome to the Granite Cornerstone Podcast, episode number 21. How is everybody doing tonight?
Doing awesome.
Doing well.
Doing
All
great.
right. Joining us this evening, we have John Glover, Scott Newberry, and Chris Busby.
Hello, guys.
Hey, everybody. And our topic of discussion tonight is an interesting one. It's one that I am very much excited about talking about. And before we get to it, I do want to give the disclaimer. Everything we say here is our opinion. Nothing is meant to be taken as right or wrong. So just go along with us. But tonight we're talking about the progressive line. Thank you, Scott, for the title and the musical inspiration for this episode. For those of you looking for this episode on YouTube, it will be copyright stricken, so you can find us on Facebook and wherever you download.
I warned you.
Yeah, I know. You did warn me, but you know what? I had to do it. So here we are. So like I said, tonight's topic is the progressive line. And I guess let's just start with the easiest question of all. And to answer this question, we're going to go to the most recent participant in a progressive line, a sitting master who has recently made appointments and been a participant as a member of a progressive line. John Glover, what is a progressive line?
Progressive line is the line of officer chairs whereby, at least in theory, a prospective master in some distant future can be trained, essentially gain experience of the various chairs, both in terms of Masonic culture, ritual, operating of the lodge, from a business perspective, all those things, so that hopefully by the time he makes his way to the east, he has enough experience that it's not a completely alien experience for him.
So I'm going to also preface this with, I believe everyone on this call, all four of us are members of lodges that participate in a progressive line. I'm not entirely sure at the lodge level, what sort of other systems exist. So if you are a member of a lodge that doesn't traditionally use a progressive officer line, please feel free to let us know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you and sort of hear about how you do things. And also the Grand Lodge of New Hampshire uses a progressive line starting at the position of Grand Junior Deacon, which is an appointment made by the incoming Grand Master. And that person is intended to sit through that position until they eventually exit the Grand East as a past Grand Master. So I know in New Hampshire, it's a very popular system, so we're going to really be talking about that. But if anybody has any input about a non-progressive line, we'll try and get that in as well, because I'd love to hear about the alternatives to the system. So let's just start with a simple question, right? What are the pros and cons of the progressive line? I say a simple question. That is not a simple question by any stretch of the imagination. But let's talk about, what the progressive line does for a lodge and why so many lodges choose to use it. Chris, what are your thoughts?
I think one of the intended benefits of a progressive line is to really participate in all aspects. Ritualistically is certainly a big part of that. And in other ways, to be able to, kind of see what the guy that's ahead of you in the line is doing, at the minimum, right? Obviously, you're really looking at the whole line, I think, all the way up. But really to learn and be mentored directly by those that are ahead of you in line, and also to again do the same on the other side, right? To make sure that the guys below you know the job that they're in, and what they're meant to do going forward. So it's really meant to be sort of an officer mentor program. I think that's certainly true from the Blue Lodge perspective and from a Grand Lodge perspective, just as much, if not even more, to make sure that that man has all of the information that they need in order to be able to be successful in their next role, and then eventually, ideally, as worshipful master of the lodge.
So, Scott, I know you love to play the devil's advocate in our podcast prep calls. So, we talked about some of the benefits here, right? Chris has mentioned some of that. What are some of the drawbacks of a progressive line? Where do we see this concept sort of fail in its either its execution or in the idea behind it in general?
Well, I think the biggest drawback to the progressive line is you're really rolling the dice on an individual and saying, yep, he's going to be around, depending on where you start the line, depending on how many terms each person sits per chair. I'll use the typical 5 officers, the 2 deacons, the 2 wardens, the master, and people sit 2 years in each chair. That's a 10-year commitment from an individual. I'd say that's probably the biggest challenge is that you're betting on someone being around for 10 years. And while most Masons hope to be around for much longer than that, we do know that life happens. And if you're working with a progressive line, you can suddenly have a hole in the middle of your line, then you got to deal with that. And that's the progressive line gives you stability, but by the same token, hiccup can cause a huge crash of that stability system and cause the lodge to scramble and figure out what they're going to do next.
That's an interesting point. I think we talk a lot about, obviously, what a progressive line is and sort of how it works, but there is an expectation set. And I think that, I sat in my lodge uses a progressive line. And before I got to the east, I think I sat for 8 years, which was actually a shorter than usual period for the progressive line. But in that time, we also had officers drop out of the progressive line. We had to replace those officers. So, what kind of expectations are set when you ask an officer to join the line? So, John, obviously, you just sort of went through this.
Yeah.
When you talk, where do you start your progressive line? At the stewards or deacons?
It kind of depends. When I came in, it was at the stewards, but previously it has been at the deacons, and at the moment it's kind of back to the deacons. And that's largely because of just the available officer candidates that we have. At the time I came in, it was on the tail end of a period where we brought in a lot of new Master Masons and actually had some brethren that wanted to be officers that couldn't be because we didn't have enough chairs to fill. How many lodges do you hear say that these days?
0.
Exactly. I got lucky. At least I consider myself lucky. I was asked to be a junior steward. And at the time, it was spelled out that this is part of the progressive line. The expectation, general expectation, because they caveated it with, obviously, life happens. It's not, you're not signing on the dotted line like you're joining the military for the next however many years. But the expectation was that
says you.
Yeah, says you, right. But the general expectation was that you would eventually make your way to the east. That said, the senior deacon's chair is considered kind of the point of no return. That any chair up to the senior deacon, you want to step out of line, no problem, no questions asked, it's fine. Once you cross from there into the wardens, then you're essentially committing yourself to the east. That's really the expectation. And just like what you experienced, Tim, it took me 8 years to get from junior steward to the east, and we have 2-year terms as well. So we had guys step out of line, 1 or 2 with health issues. So the only chair I skipped was senior steward, but only spent a year as junior and senior deacons each, respectively. But still, from what I understand, across the jurisdiction and in other jurisdictions, 8 years to work your way up through the line typically is actually rather long nowadays. Usually it's more like 4 or 5 years from what I've heard, anecdotally.
5 year, yeah.
When I went through the line, we did 1-year terms, so I went 5 years through the line.
Yeah, so I consider myself very blessed to have had that time to work my way up through the line. And at my lodge, thankfully, well, I should say that at least one thing that we do that works very well for us, that seems to, is each of the chairs, especially once you hit senior deacon, has additional responsibilities placed on it, not just ritualistically. We all know that. That's obvious from the ritual book. But, for example, the senior deacon is traditionally the Grand Lodge representative, so he is expected to go to Grand Lodge. The junior warden, he becomes the head of the finance committee, and so he's actually got his feet wet in the business of the lodge. The senior warden is dealing with special ladies, and he has additional responsibilities as well. So the general responsibilities of the lodge are spread out across the officer corps, but they're traditionally assigned to specific chairs so that as you work your way up, you gain more and more experience into how the lodge works. When it works well, it's great. But as you described, though, all it takes is one guy to drop out or have a couple that are coming in at the bottom that maybe aren't as strong, and the brittleness of it can really show.
Well,
But
so
I'm
no,
sorry,
go ahead,
go ahead, Tim.
Chris.
No, what I was going to say is you describe it, and John, I'm very impressed with what you said. And this is not something that I've heard you say before, because the committee assignments and all of these other aspects, which actually mirror more of what from my experience, Grand Lodge does, right? At each step there is a specific additional non-ritualistic, opportunity for a brother to become a part of a specific aspect of the lodge in order to grow. And I will tell you that my experience was probably the complete opposite of that. And that's not to detriment any of the brethren or officers or past masters of my lodge. I think in my particular example, our lodge had gotten very, 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 very small, to the point to where there was question, right, as to whether or not that there was going to be a future. So from that perspective, there is no sort of you're going to be. I mean, you're on the finance committee, but everyone in the top five is in the finance committee, and the master's essentially chairing it. It's still not not specific. Okay, as senior deacon, you do this beyond ritual, right? As far as the business of the lodge is concerned. So that's a very different experience. I know, Tim, you just kind of agreed, saying that is like that's even more structured than I've seen in lodges that tend to have that structure.
I have to agree with that as well, because I've seen in lodges.
Scott, you're agreeing with me? That never.
Yeah, I know, it's a strange thing right on the calendar right now, but one of the things that that I've come across is, and it's becoming less and less now, but because our older generations are leaving us, unfortunately. But there was this very large tendency in lodges to have specific brothers do the same thing, regardless of where they sat in the lodge room. So we know that Brother Smith always throws the table lodge. He does it in June. He does it on the third Saturday, and we can all expect it to happen. And we did see the same thing in ritual. And then all of a sudden, Brother Smith's no longer there, and nobody knows how to do a table lodge, because he's the one who's done it every year for the last 20 years. So it's one of the things that, he may have picked it up as he went through the line, and then he's gone, and it wasn't associated with anyone learning something as they move through the line. So I think it's a huge piece that we miss out on, is people will go through the line and they may never get another thing to do the entire time they're in the line other than learn the ritual and get ready for the next chair. So it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, and John, I'm going to echo everything that's already been said. That is a remarkable experience from a line office perspective. I mean, certainly, again, nothing to say bad about my lodge, but when I was, I don't even remember that when I was asked to join the line that I was even told what I was doing. I distinctly remember being told that I needed to bring pie every other stated meeting as junior steward, and I'm pretty sure that's where it ended. And I've said this several times on this podcast, off this podcast. I was told that I needed to bring pie once every 2 months, and now all of a sudden I have a purple apron. I don't know what happened in between, but here we are.
Those must have been damn good pies.
Listen, they were great. But I'm going to say
at the store on the way home.
Yeah, right. Shaw's. But I think it's very interesting, that you were approached and given the full scope, or as much scope as you can be given, but also the mentorship program that really does seem to echo, like Chris said, the Grand Lodge experience. And I think that's where you see the strength in a progressive line. One of the things that I kind of wanted to touch on tonight, and this may be a touchy subject, but is bad fits, right? So you've got an officer you appoint as a junior steward, okay? And in that period of time, they may serve a 1, 2, 4, whatever, X number of years before they get to senior deacon. What happens if that potential line officer or that current line officer isn't a great fit for the line? And really, how do you rectify that situation? And what should you do there to maintain the integrity of your lodge officer line going forward, but also make sure that brother is either not going to the east or is better prepared for it based on the conversations you've been having? So really, where do we fall when we have a bad fit, somebody who may not be a great master.
Well, I mean the ritual says what the duties of the master are. To preserve the harmony of the lodge, to do everything that they can to preserve the integrity of what we do, and to maintain the strength of the lodge and the line. And I think the most important piece of that for any master when he makes appointments is to set expectations, right? And I think you kind of touched on that, Tim. Right?
Yep.
If we're not setting those expectations, those conversations become a lot more difficult, because if you haven't communicated what you expect out of somebody, when the time comes, it's gonna be a challenge. And we're an organization that wants to maintain harmony, that wants to have brothers feel as though that they're included, and it's a tough situation to be in as a master to then say, you know what, this isn't working out. So it's harder in the position in which you have not done that, not laid everything out, especially not only just when you appoint somebody, but laying out sort of the expectations over time, and having successive masters sort of communicate their expectations in that way, so that there is sort of this again progressive understanding of, okay, if I'm in this position, this is going to be is what's expected of me. But the master is going to have his own particular sets of expectations, because he's going to bring his particular brand to how he leads in the East, and so that's going to be important from day one. But again, understanding, setting those expectations, and really identifying what the goals of the lodge are and what the goals of the position are early is extraordinarily important to be able to help to maintain that harmony.
Well, so we got a comment in the chat from Bo, who says it comes to the vote, but often, or in my opinion, right, the masters who are promoting these individuals through the progressive line should be not even allowing it to get to a vote by removing those potential issues prior to your elected officer position. So typically, a master has unilateral authority to appoint whoever he chooses as a senior or junior steward, senior or junior deacon. So I think that the point of whispering good counsel is very important, but what do we do to replace those individuals? So this kind of talks about filling the hole again. I know that I didn't skip any chairs, but I short sat in a couple. I think I did a year as senior steward, a year as junior deacon, because some people left. And Tom Ladd brings up a good point about allowing new affiliates to come into the lodge who may not have been able to get into the officer line to be integrated into that line. But when you're filling a hole in the line, say your senior deacon, as right before he's heading to that chair, decides that he doesn't want to do this, what's the best approach? Obviously, you can move the whole line up, right? Or you can slot somebody in. And I think both of those have, good and bad aspects. So I want to talk about that. Scott, what would a sitting master, you need to appoint a senior deacon. The guy you thought was going to sit there doesn't want to sit there. What are you going to do?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, it's one of those things that you have to look at it from different perspectives based on what chair it is.
Yeah.
When you're looking at an appointed chair, Tim, if I was thinking you were going to be the senior deacon because you served as junior deacon for the last set of terms, and you come to me and say, "Look, I'm not interested in moving on," that's a very different question and discussion than your junior warden saying, "I don't want to move on."
Oh, absolutely.
So it's a huge difference in how you approach it. The biggest challenge I think you have to have whenever you're filling a hole, and this goes back to the lodge culture. If the lodge culture is progressive, and you will continue to progress through the chairs regardless. And, I realize that that's an old tradition that some lodges still maintain, where if you start, you finish. That's all there is to it. So if you're looking at filling a hole in that type of environment, the biggest question you have to ask anyone you're considering appointing is, are you willing to finish the line? And that limits a lot of individuals as far as who you could possibly ask. Because there are a lot of past masters out there who will say, I'm not interested in being master again. I'll fill in for you. And that's a piece of the puzzle that you can also do is you don't necessarily have to appoint, you don't necessarily have to elect. You can just do a per diem, a pro tem. It's hey, I did that my first year's master. I did not have an individual I thought would be a good fit for junior deacon. So I appointed every single meeting, every single communication. We appointed a junior deacon. More often than not, I tapped my father because he knew the role, and let's face it, he's there, and I get to look at him at the other end of the room, keep him away from me. But
Jesus.
unfortunately he's not here to defend himself. But he'd probably say the same thing about me.
And I'm sure, I guarantee you, in a couple of years, your son will be saying the same thing about you.
I think he's already saying that.
Why do you think?
Fair enough, but he doesn't have the power yet.
I'm Tyler. I mean, what else can you ask for?
You can't get further away.
No, but I think that's one of the big pieces is that when you start to look at how do I fill the line, that has to be part of the question. If we slot you in to fill this hole that we suddenly have, are you willing to continue on and finish the line, or are you just interested in being here just for the 1 year so people can move up behind you? Those are parts of the conversation that have to happen, and it's a little bit more difficult, I think, to fill a hole the further up the line you go, because now you're dealing with now we no longer have a senior warden because he doesn't want to progress. The junior warden doesn't want to move on, or heaven forbid, your senior warden right before he's supposed to step into the E says, "Nope, sorry, can't do it." All of the thought processes and planning are now moved.
And I think that, and this might be somewhat of an unpopular opinion among some, and I know John Ramsdell earlier said about Rising Sun, there are no officers in the line that are past masters, which is wonderful, of course, right? You want guys that, you want fresh guys in those chairs if you can, but there is something to be said about slotting in a past master if needed, the right past master in that role, even for a short period of time. It helps to maintain some of that strength. Obviously, that person has that knowledge. I think Scott, obviously your father was a past master. Same situation, right? It can be, past masters. I am one. All of us are one at this point, including you, John. We can also be pains in the butt. And so, all of us at some point or another are a pain in the butt in our lodge in reference to, to that stuff. So you have to be careful, right? You want to be there as a past master to be able to support, to be able to help to execute the will of the worshipful master, train guys around you, and give that time so that if there is an officer junior to you that needs that more time, to give it to them and give them instructions so that when they do move and that past master steps back out, it maintains the integrity of the line, and hopefully the officers below him have gotten more out of that experience.
So, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say something we're sort of skirting around is, and I don't mean to imply that anyone's avoiding it, but it's one of what I call the brittle aspects of the progressive line, and that is, we look at its purpose and all agree that it can have wonderful benefits if you have the right set of dedicated brethren to go through it, and they're all potentially good masters. It's a wonderful mentoring program. They can all learn from each other. You have continuity with the officers of the line. Just think of all the past masters you're going to be generating who have all worked with each other before. But when it starts to not work because you have guys who are dropping out of the line, or you're not raising enough master masons to come in at the bottom of it, and you're trying to avoid things like recycling past masters, or asking a brother to step out because it's just not working, or forcing brethren to move up the line whether they're ready or not because, well, it's time to move up. And then the line itself can be an anchor around the neck of the lodge, because you're trying to slavishly adhere to the purpose of the line, but it's no longer able to really operate in the best interest of the lodge as a whole for the given period of time, when perhaps plugging in a past master or two, even if they do have to go all the way to the east, even just for a year, maybe that's the best approach for a given lodge at a given point in time.
At a given time.
Yeah,
And and lodge culture. Yeah, I mean that's what it boils down to, and what resources that you have in the moment, because there are lodges that simply there are many lodges. Mine has been one of those lodges from at one time or another that just don't. There's just really no one else, right? In those moments, so you do have to make the best decision that you can for masonry, for the lodge, for the brethren.
Well, I think John just made an argument against a progressive line.
It is.
Because, I mean, if you look at it, it's one of those things where, maybe you don't move people up just because they sat. Maybe you take a look at who actually has the chops, for lack of a better term, to go ahead and say, gee, I think, out of everybody we've got, we should really think about re-electing, Worshipful Busby back to the east, because he's the best man for the job at this time. Assuming he's agreeable to it. And we're going to appoint, Tim as our senior deacon because we really need a strong person in that role. We got a lot of candidates coming through. He's the best man for the job. Versus just because Scot was junior deacon last year, he gets to be senior deacon this year. It's something that, not a lot of lodges look at, because it does eliminate the predictability and the stability, because you never know what you're going to have year to year, because you're making the decisions based on what's best for the lodge at the time.
Well, so one of the questions I had, right, is do we sort of force the progressive line on our constituent lodges with our requirements to serve as master of a lodge, right? There's arguments.
There's only one requirement.
That requirement is serving as a warden for at least 6 months.
Right, but that's it. I mean, but you don't have to serve as any other chair prior to being a warden.
That's true, but is there a potential that by requiring a previous junior position, we inherently build a reliance on a progressive line?
Probably, but that may not necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, having a brother who has been a Mason, say a very active Mason, he's a ritualistic expert, very knowledgeable in Masonic history, whatever. He's been around the block a few times for, as much as 20 years or something, and suddenly, but has never been an officer, and suddenly wants to become master, sits as warden for a year, and then becomes master, probably will do pretty well. But a brand new Master Mason suddenly becoming a master in less than 2 years, if foisting a progressive line onto a lodge just by culture can kind of prevent that and make him take longer, I think I'd be in favor of that because of the ancillary benefits. Because he could be in the East, but he's not going to be a good master.
And that does make a lot of sense. I do see that argument, but it's an interesting conversation when we have these requirements and we see the way brethren progress. The only way to become a warden is to get elected. And generally, the easiest way to do that is to prove your mettle by showing up as a junior officer. So as a junior officer, the progressive line makes that easy. So it's an interesting sort of question is, do we allow for an alternative to the system?
Well, if I remember correctly, I don't believe there's anything in the system as far as requirements other than that one requirement for master. Anybody can be elected to a chair. Anybody can be appointed to any appointed positions. The only requirement is you have to be a master mason.
In good standing.
Yep. So if you want to be senior deacon, as long as you're in good standing as a master mason, you can be senior deacon provided you're appointed. But one of the things that comes up when you think about it, and John, you mentioned something. You've got a brother. He's well versed in the history. He knows the ritual. He's a likable guy. Everybody, he just feels like he's a natural leader for the lodge, but he doesn't want to be a leader. So it's and that's one of the challenges that you have is you get one of those brothers that everybody wants. Well, it'd be great to see him as master. We need to get him as master. Well, he doesn't want to be master.
But what if he does want to be master, but he doesn't want to be junior steward? He doesn't want to be senior steward. He doesn't want to be junior deacon.
Well, that's when it comes back to the lodge culture. If the lodge culture says you must serve, then you must serve.
No, I think, Scott, you just kind of bring up an interesting point that's I've seen and it's popped in my head, and that is identifying brothers and saying, "Wow, you'd really make a great master." 6 months after they become a master mason, and saying, "Hey, you want to get in line? You want to get in line? You want to get in line?" And look, there again, we have lodges that have need, no question about that. But what kind of disservice do we do by saying you're going to be master one day? Right, not too long after they come off, the proverbial master mason boat and land on our shores and are really just getting their heads wrapped around all of this, and then we say, okay, we want you.
And I know for a fact that I was that guy. I know Chris was that guy.
I passed on being that guy. I was actually asked to be junior steward, which was part of the progressive line of the lodge I joined, before the night of my master mason degree was over. Yeah, they were. I was shaking hands with the members of the lodge, after the degree, and the gentleman who was going to be master of the lodge asked me if I was interested in being the junior steward.
Yikes!
So, I mean, of course, you have to understand the pedigree. So, Dad was a past master. The name was known in the building, in the fraternity. So it's like the assumption was I was just going to go ahead and say yes. I said no because I had another year of college left. So.
And I think that's the thing that, like Chris said, right? You're asking a guy to be master of a lodge in somewhere between, let's call it 5 and 15 years, right? And that guy's been a mason for 15 minutes. How do we justify making those? I know, obviously, listen, we're not necessarily full of choice here. We do things because we have to in a lot of cases.
I think that's what happens more often than not. It's we've got to fill this chair.
And we're not judging certainly not judging any situation in which that has to happen, right? Because they absolutely are. Yeah.
Chris was master in 5 years before I was even, I think, senior deacon. Yeah. Chris was initiated 3 or 4 months after I was.
Yeah. But I was also hungry and impatient.
You're
myself
still
at that time.
Many of those things.
Thank you. I just ate, so thank you.
Yeah.
Also.
But what kind of disservice do we do ourselves? And I think, Scott, you kind of hit the nail on the head, right? We may need to fill that position, but we don't need to install somebody into that position.
No, you don't. Like I said, when I was master, I didn't fill the junior deacon's chair by appointment. I just did, a pro tem the first year by meeting because I didn't have anybody. The second year I went in as master. I had someone I could appoint them. But I'll be honest with you, when I started the line, I was a fill-in. I was a pro tem myself. The individual that was supposed to take the chair just suddenly dropped off the face of the earth. Or the word on the vine was, the family business needed him, so he went and did that. And I filled the chair for 6 months before the master walked over and asked me if I wanted to be installed as the junior deacon. So, I mean, it's a challenge because when you need the chair filled, you need the chair filled. And I think a lot of lodges aren't comfortable leaving a chair empty. They want to have someone associated with the chair. And when you leave the chair empty, it's for a lot of people, it's uncomfortable. But sometimes it's the right decision.
Yeah. Well, my first year, I didn't have any stewards. And I understand that's fairly common in most lodges. It's not common at Horace Chase. We always have stewards. And it was quite uncomfortable not having them. For a regular stated meeting, no big deal, really. But for degree work, every time we did a degree, I had to find a couple of guys to be stewards. I could get
them. There's a little heavy lifting that needs to be done there.
Yeah. A little bit, yeah. And even thinking about the deacons, I was trying to imagine what it would be like having pro tem, junior or senior deacon. Junior deacon not so bad as senior deacon, of course, but thinking about again all those degrees that you're going to be doing, I got to find a steward. I can find a warm body pretty much and quickly teach them the floor work for a degree, and they'll muddle through it. Junior deacon, a little harder. Senior deacon, that's not going to happen. I need to find somebody who knows the ritual or can at least learn it.
Yeah. That's when you turn to the corner full of past masters grumbling to themselves and say, listen, I need somebody to do something. But
and if you're lucky, one of them says yes.
Yeah. Well, absolutely.
So I was thinking there's some an aspect of this we haven't really talked about, and we didn't even talk about it a couple of weeks ago when we first discussed this topic, is the history of where progressive lines came from. Because I was just thinking about Anderson's Constitution, which we're celebrating its 300th anniversary this year. There was no concept of you couldn't even build a progressive line out of the way the officers are defined in Anderson's Constitution. The idea is you have a master who's installed, who then appoints his wardens. I don't even recall necessarily if deacons are there or not. The wardens aren't even elected. Even in the Grand Lodge, I don't think they were elected. They had pretty tightly defined duties. But in a constituent lodge, as I recall, the master would take essentially the most seasoned fellow of the craft and appoint him as his warden, as his primary educator of the brethren in the lodge. And that was pretty much it. You did have a handful of other officers who had specific duties, but there was no line. You really couldn't imagine a line. That said, there was a concept of progression in seniority, if you will, just amongst the brethren as a whole. There are some wonderful woodcuts from the 18th century, for example, that show where the newest entered apprentice, for example, would be placed in the lodge, and there's like an arch of all of the brethren going around the room, and they were placed in terms of seniority. And in some respects, we still have that today, thinking about where is the youngest entered apprentice placed versus where do the past masters tend to sit. It's that same balance. So from between there and today, somewhere the progressive line was born. I don't know where that was. I don't know how long it took, but
it's interesting that you bring that up, John, because when I hear you talking through that, it's a progression based on experience and seniority, not based on someone's choice or a vote.
Except for the master.
Right. So if you take a look at that, you get into a situation where you have a lodge, you've got brothers that have been in the fraternity 10, 15, 20 years. You would think they're fairly well versed, at least in the running of a lodge, the basics of the ritual, those kinds of things. But yet the master has been a master mason for 4 years.
So
it's an interesting thought process that you see the how it was done, where it's based on seniority as you go around the room, and now it's the whoever's willing to pick up the mantle.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of what we've done in masonry over the course of those years is out of at least at the time perceived necessity, and I don't mean innovation in the way that it sounds dirty to masons, but is an innovation in that as lodges became more numerous, as masonry became more popular, as more brethren joined the craft, you needed to have some sort of structure. At some point, I think the brethren at the time would have felt that they needed some structure in order to be able to guide folks along in the process. And as Grand Lodges came into existence and Grand Lodge governments became, large governance became more complicated, then more of that information needed to be passed down. I mean, we've created, the system of Freemasonry is more complex now than it's ever been. In many different aspects, and so I think that happened. The problem is that when you go the opposite way for a time, as Masonry has, it's shrunk, right? You don't have the guys sort of vying for, and you know what I mean, trying to do the best they can in order to compete with each other in a friendly way to then hopefully be appointed. You really have sort of not the opposite of that, but by necessity, by those that are willing to participate. And so I think that changes very much the dynamic of what a progressive line ends up being in that scenario.
So I'm going to pose a question, right? And this, we can kind of use this question to head towards the end of the episode. But I want to know, we know that there are Grand Lodges that don't use a progressive line, right? The Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, we've had past Grand Master of Massachusetts on this podcast tell us that they don't use a progressive line like we do. They have elected wardens. There's a pool, and again, I don't remember how it all worked. It seemed very complicated to me. But is there a system, especially at the Blue Lodge level, right? When we talk about Grand Lodge, it's a little bit easier to not have a progressive line because you generally have a pool of Grand Lodge officers, you have a pool of past masters. And if you limit eligibility to those individuals, obviously you get a more experienced and potentially ready crop of individuals. At the Blue Lodge level, is there a system that works for the Grand Line, for the progress, or for the line? Sorry, is there another alternative where you just appoint officers and they may be gone next year and never seen again? Like, is that an alternative that would work in today's masonry?
I think it just depends on the individual lodge. I mean, there's Phoenix Lodge, for example. Most people would probably not consider it a traditional Blue Lodge because it doesn't tend to bring Masons up from nothing to eventually become master. It tends to attract a lot more seasoned Masons. It's almost like a mini Grand Lodge, if you will, because so many of the members are past masters, or even wearing purple aprons, that every year they can follow the very traditional Andersonian method of who's the best person to be in a particular chair. And part of that is the length of their cable toe, because Chris, you might be the absolute best person to be master next year, but if your cable toe is not long enough to do that, then it's not appropriate to put you in that position. Other lodges may be so small and be part of such a small community that they get so few new brethren coming in that really having a progressive line just doesn't work for them. And it's the whole spectrum. And it's not even static for a given lodge. It's going to change dynamically over time.
But I think the challenge is that the lodge has to accept that as their method of doing things going forward.
Yeah.
And I think that's where part of the challenge is. And I realize I'm going to invoke the word we all hate. It's tradition to do a progressive line in most lodges. And that's where you start to run up against we've always done it this way, so we're going to continue to do it this way, and we'll muddle through and figure something out, versus, like what you said, John, who's the best person for the job at this point? It really should be that way, in my opinion, but it's a major mindset shift for a lot of lodges.
Yeah. Well, and personal opinion as to what constitutes the best person for a given job is also important. For example, thinking of the master, for me, I would like to see someone who has sat in a variety of chairs, because it demonstrates a level of commitment, not just to masonry as a whole and to the lodge, but also to learning different parts of ritual. Somebody may be an absolutely fantastic leader, but if they haven't wrought in the quarries right in the lodge, I would lean more towards somebody else, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like I said, it's a big mindset shift. I mean, it's the other thing I think that causes challenges for us is we don't like to. It goes back to the harmony of the lodge. No one wants to see conflict. When's the last time you saw multiple people stand for elected position? It's a rarity.
Yeah. Certainly not often outside of a secretary or treasurer position.
And it usually brings disharmony.
Yeah. I mean, I have seen elections. I've been involved with elections where it's been multiple people. I actually sat in a lodge meeting where they had 4 individuals stand to be master of the lodge that year. There was concerns about the current master. There was concerns about the senior warden moving up. There was concerns about another individual who was qualified as past master. He's a past master of another lodge, and it was an interesting election. Because it then shifted things around as far as the rest of the chairs go, because there were people that, why didn't you stand for senior warden or junior warden or, one of the other elected positions? And, it's a brother's choice. I'm interested in being master of the lodge. I think I can do a good job there. Don't really want to sit in the other lodge, in the other chairs.
Can I ask real quick, Scott?
Yep.
In that contested election, did the guy who everybody expected to become master get elected?
It was interesting because there really was no clear cut. This is what the lodge was expecting.
Okay.
I think the at the end of the day, the master was probably a needed master for the lodge, but maybe not necessarily what the lodge was expecting.
Okay. Because the thing that the progressive line does, in my opinion, is it tells the lodge, right? The lodge essentially gets rid of all responsibility for themselves to vote. And it just tells the lodge who they need to vote for. And you see this at Grand Lodge. You certainly see it in some lodges where you've got a list of these are the last year's officers.
Yep.
They're all standing for next year's officers. Here you go. And I think that absolves the lodge of responsibility from actually making a decision.
It does. I have seen a warden voted out of office, though. And the brother who was voted out of office took it very hard.
I can imagine.
So, I mean, and I know from where I was sitting that night, it was uncomfortable to watch because, my lodge elects, in October, and then you're sitting there for a couple of months, you're on your way out, don't have an office for next year. It makes it a real uncomfortable situation for that individual and for the rest of the lodge, especially those who thought he would be good to continue on in that particular role or move up to the next role. But the will of the lodge spoke and said, no, we don't think you're right for it.
We as Masons have to be self-aware. I think probably more so than most, as far as what our abilities are and what we've contributed to the lodge. And I feel sometimes as though that we lose focus on what being an officer of a lodge is.
You're a servant.
Right. It's service, right? At the very end of the day, all the pomp and circumstance out the window. You're there as a servant leader at every station. I've heard it said many times, once a steward, always a steward. Once an entered apprentice, always an. It's the same sort of concept. And I think that it pervades Freemasonry, is that we need to keep our minds on target to the idea that we are here to serve the brethren. We are here to serve the lodge. We are here to enrich each other's lives and to enrich and maintain and be stewards of the future of the lodge. And if we can't do that at a particular time as a particular person in a particular position, then we shouldn't. And that's where sort of, again, humans are, egotistical creatures, all of us are. And sort of that we end up butting heads and really pulling away from, I think, the purpose of Masonry. So I think part of it is just maintaining, as an officer, maintaining that humility and that sense of service to understand that, and it is a meritocracy what we do, right? A progressive line is meant to be a lodge line is meant to be a meritocracy, that as long as we're keeping those things in mind, then if it doesn't work out for us along the line, then we should be able to be prepared to say, you know what? I'm not the right guy at this time. I'm going to go ahead and step aside. And so, again, it all comes down to how we communicate these things. And again, humans are humans. These things are going to happen. It's not, Masonry isn't this, is not this sort of utopian panacea of everything that always works all the time. It doesn't, but it is an ideal that we hope that we're going to maintain. And those are the things that I think that I hope that we would maintain focus on.
Yeah. I sit here having talked about all this stuff and I don't know what the solution is. I don't know if a progressive line that pushes brothers ahead who are potentially not ready is necessarily the best choice, or if there's another alternative. I mean, we're not here to necessarily solve that question or answer that question, but it's interesting that there are alternatives and we may just, we haven't necessarily found the right one yet.
I think it's a situation where the lodge itself needs to have the conversation.
Oh, absolutely.
Does this make sense for us? We've been doing it this way for the last 100 years. Does it still make sense?
Does it make sense now and then in 2, 3, 5 years? Does it make sense
right
now? Because these generations are generations as we go through, right? You think of a generation of brothers, a brother that goes through the line, those are relatively short periods of time, and our lodges change actually very quickly.
My home lodge right now is right on the cusp of a major shift, because our junior officers right now are literally the sons of the existing officers. So we're about to have a generational shift going into the officer, as the officers come up. And that's huge. They've got a different approach to stuff. Luckily, they're the young men that are coming up have got good heads on their shoulders. They're both senior DMLAs, so they've been around the block, at least at a lower level. But it's going to be interesting to see how they approach, how they run a lodge, and how they handle the situations. I remember when I sat, and I'm sure all of you can remember a time too, where you sat in the East and suddenly had to counsel a brother who was chronologically your senior and Masonically your senior, and it's not an easy thing to do. So it'll be interesting to see how the next generation handles it.
Yeah, and I think that's always going to be a challenge for any progressive line. You've always got guys coming in who are relatively new, relatively fresh, have different ideas, and have to speak a little bit of truth to power sometimes.
Yep.
With that, we've talked a lot about this topic. I think there's been a lot of good things said. It's an interesting topic that I think I could talk about for a very long time. I've certainly been talking about it for years in private conversations. But any closing thoughts about the progressive line, about the way we handle those officer positions? We'll just kind of go around the clock here. John?
I think I've been on the fence for a long time about whether it's a good idea or not. I think there are some pros and cons both ways, and it's just up to the lodge. That said, I will take a page from what I did a few months ago as we were approaching our elections last year. And I think that I would hope that this was beneficial to my lodge. Unless I do a polling, there's no way to really be able to know. But I reminded the lodge that even though we have a progressive line and it is generally speaking very successful, its purpose is for mentoring officers and as a proving ground for those officers. But it is not a golden ticket to the East. There's no legal basis behind it at all. It's a great tool, but it's a tool for the lodge. And for the brethren of the lodge. And the officers, the appointed officers, all serve at the pleasure of the master, but the elected officers serve at the pleasure of the lodge. We are all, like Chris said earlier, we are all servants. And if we need to continually be improving ourselves and proving ourselves as officers, both to our superiors within the line and also to the lodge. And that's a message both of the officers within the line, in order to remind them that, hey, you're not just going to get a free ride. You have to keep proving yourself. But to the brethren, that if you're not happy, be involved.
Yep.
And I think that'd be a helpful message to any lodge.
No, I think that is a great thought. Chris?
Just very basic for me is, listen to the brethren. Do what you need to do for your lodge now. Traditions are wonderful, but traditions, if mismanaged, could do you harm too. So think of what's working for your lodge now, and involve your brethren. Make plans. Communicate those plans. If you make longer term plans, something we didn't cover, we talked about the other day, make longer term plans and involve the officers, involve the brethren in those plans. And you can't make everyone happy. You can't get everyone to agree. Certainly, never going to do that. If you do, you're going to be in trouble. But try to at least create a vision for what the lodge should be. And I think that if you do that, and you put the right guys in line, that vision helps to perpetuate a common goal and a common feel for the lodge going forward.
Scott?
I think the big thing to take away from all this is to have the conversation. Especially with lodges that are struggling to fill the line, or even lodges that have a stack of brothers that want to get into the line. Have the conversation. Understand what you want the lodge to do and to become. Like Chris said, traditions are wonderful, so they hamper us and prevent us from doing our best work. And I think that's one of the big challenges of masonry in general. Not to take the tradition and throw it away, but to hold it up to the light and say, is this the right tradition for our lodge? Should we experiment and try something a little different, even if it's for a short period of time? Maybe, decide that, what, the junior warden's chair is an open election. Anybody who feels they're qualified should be able to stand and be considered, versus the expectation that you've got to serve as a senior deacon to get there. Take a look at those types of traditions in your lodges and say, is this really the right way our lodge should be going now, given younger masons that haven't been in the fraternity as long, a shortage of the masons we need to fill the line? Take a look at them, have the conversation. Maybe at the end of the day, you stay with what you've got, and then maybe you make a few shifts and do some kind of hybrid that we haven't really talked about here yet tonight. So that's my biggest suggestion to any lodge. If you feel that you're being hampered, take a minute and have the conversation, but be sure to include all of the active brethren. Don't leave someone off on the side who's not, I'll say, don't leave the Tyler outside so he doesn't know what's going on. Make sure you include everybody, because maybe someone's got an idea that you haven't thought of yet.
Yeah, I think to close this out, I think we've had a lot of good conversation. John, I really love, the mentorship and the way that you talked about how your lodge handles that progression. I mean, Horace Chase obviously has a number of past Grand Masters amongst their membership, and it appears some of those lessons from the Grand Lodge may have made their way to the lodge level. But I think what Scott and Chris just said is very important. Have those conversations, involve everyone. And really, this is a decision of the lodge. As much as important as it is to elect a master, it's important to understand every other officer position and what your role and responsibility is as a member of that lodge. This is a valuable conversation to bring home to your own lodges. And I wish everybody luck. I hope we were able to impart some wisdom, or at least provide enjoyable conversation. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our panel this evening, and have a good night, everyone.